A lot of time we leave the sound off for the prayer, but yeah. All right. Clark?
Heavenly Father, we love you. We thank you for your word to study, for your presence in our midst. We pray that we will learn from your word, that we'll obey and submit to your word, that we'll come closer to you, that all of us will grow together here. We pray especially, though, for those who cannot be here, for those who are sick, for those who have a special need for your healing, Lord. We pray that you'll help them to feel your love and ours, that your hand will be upon them to heal them. In Christ's name.
Amen. All right. We've made it to week 4 already of 80. I'm going to stick with that number, see if we can't get there, of kings and prophets. And so part of the two big things I'm hoping we accomplish, besides greater understanding and maybe insight for ourselves and for our faith, to think about kings from the standpoint of how kings and prophets went together and balanced off each other. Because Israel already had a king, right? They had Yahweh, but they wanted somebody they could see, so they could be like everybody else. And so God gave them what they wanted. That's a scary thought, right? If God gives us what we want, sometimes we decide maybe that's not what we really wanted. You ask a question, you get an answer you didn't want. Maybe one of those kind of situations. So what was the role of the prophet? What was the role of the king? What were they to do for the people? And to get a deeper understanding of how they influence each other. Because prophets really became the people who could speak to the king. As the kings developed more power, they needed somebody who brought a different voice, a godly voice to them. Because the problem with power when you have it is you lose part of your accountability, right? I can do what I want. So that's kind of the backdrop and the background of this. So I'm not trying to tell the whole story of the kings, but to concentrate on some details that maybe we don't always concentrate on, or at least help us get greater understanding of that king. So, we didn't really spend a lot of time on Saul. We talked about Saul when he was found among the prophets. He started out really well, but he lost his way. And David, we didn't spend a lot of time with the interaction between the two of them. In fact, we've kind of raced to the end of David's life. If you remember from last week, David had a bunch of wives and a bunch of kids. By a bunch, I mean 8 wives that we know of, not counting the concubines, 19 sons, and at least 1 named daughter that we know about. And, and then it kind of says and all the others. So he probably couldn't even name all of his children. It's a different dynamic than what we're used to. When we reach the point of not being able to remember our children, that signifies we got other problems, right? It's not a numbers problem. It's usually an age problem or some other mental capacity. But not for David. Lots of kids and lots of wives. And so now we find David at the end of his life. And so that's what we're going to look at. And here's the setup for the week. We're reminded that God didn't use people because they did everything right. David certainly didn't. And I hope you find that an encouragement, right? Sometimes it's easy to think, well, I've made some major mistakes and errors and misunderstandings. How could God use me? Well, I think that's the proper way to see a hero of faith. We don't need to take David and set him up as this perfect example of how to be in all aspects of his life, because nobody should do that, right? It's to resist this idea that king is somehow elevated and can do no wrong. And at the same time, even in the midst of sin, that he could still express a lot of faith. Sometimes we make those opposites, right? If you're messing up, you can't have faith. And if you have faith, you're not messing up. And we put expectations on people that aren't fair. And so David helps to remind us he was a real man with real issues. And part of the problem when you're a king and you're old and you have a number of sons is there's going to be a race to who replaces you, right? Because the Israelites aren't going, oh, we don't need a king anymore. The sons who might be king aren't going, I don't think we should have one brother over all the others. You know, a couple of them took themselves out of the running. Amnon, Absalom are out of the way. And Adonijah, or how did you say it the other day, Denise? Adonijah, you might have heard it that way. You know me enough by now, I don't pronounce things well, so don't take my pronunciation as a gospel. And the truth is, he probably said it different than both of those, right? He spoke a totally different language. But David's third son, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5, put himself forward and said, I will be king. It's obvious that David's on the downhill slide. And so Adonijah said, I'm the one. And what is appropriate about his expectation? He's the oldest surviving son. Wouldn't that be right? He probably grew up with that expectation. Hey, my two other older brothers are gone. I'm next in line. Isn't that the way things work? That's the way things are supposed to be. Part of the problem, though, we're kind of shed a little light here, is he's not asking David, right, for one. And he's doing this before David's gone. He's trying to get this all wrapped up. He said, I will be king. So he got chariots and horses ready, 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never rebuked him by asking, why do you behave as you do? So see, that's a little bit of insight too. He's been given a lot of leash a lot of times, so he doesn't find it unusual that he can just push his will. And apparently, as if it matters, he was very handsome. So we see part of David's struggle is he doesn't know how to interact with his kids. He doesn't know how to, at least from his first wives, have the kind of relationship that he needed. And Adonijah is not ignorant of what's going on, because look what he does in verse 7. He confers with Joab. Joab was a military commander, right? Abiathar, the priest, and they gave him his support. For this now oldest remaining son, this is a political issue, right? If I can get everybody lined up on my side, if I can pronounce myself, then I'm going to be king. But what is he leaving out? From the very beginning, for the Israelites, the choice of king wasn't about who made the most political sense. But the purpose of the king was to lead the people in their service to God. And that was of more importance. Yeah, he's leaving that part out, right? A little inconvenient. Don't ask a question you don't want to know the answer to, right? Just say, this is what we're going to do. So he goes, verse 9, he has a big party. He's sacrificing sheep, and he invited all his brothers and the king's sons and the royal officials. But notice in verse 10, he did not invite Nathan, the prophet, or Benaniah, or the special guard. Benaniah was the head of David's bodyguard. He might have not liked this, or his brother Solomon. So it appears that even this older son, older than Solomon, born in Hebron, long before David got to Jerusalem, understood there was something different about Solomon. And the question, and it's going to remain a question, how much did people know about David's promise that Solomon was going to be the next king? It's not clear from the text exactly how wide that was known or when that announcement was made. But it was certainly known to a few. But to me, I would love to know the timeline of that. Did Adoniah, I'll use Denise's pronunciation. Did I say it right? Close enough? Adonijah. Did he know about Solomon and the promise that he would be king, and that's why he's acting? See, this whole passage raises a lot of questions. But what I really want to note there in verse 10 is the role of Nathan the prophet. The little bit we know about David's life, Nathan was very influential on numerous occasions, with a lot of bravery, speaking the strong words of rebuke to David. And he was known as a man of God. So this son, not trying to pull him in, probably realized he couldn't, but he needed to kind of go around him. So Nathan's back to work, verse 11. Then Nathan asked Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king?" Not is wanting to become king, but has become king. "And our Lord David knows nothing about it." Sometimes you have to work to keep things going the way they're supposed to go, right? Just because it's the right way doesn't mean it doesn't come without any effort and encouragement. Nathan realized things are about to go sideways, so he hatches a plan. And his plans, if you remember, have been pretty successful. "Now then, let me advise you how you can save your own life and the life of your son Solomon." Why is this about life and death? Well, if the oldest son becomes king, what's going to happen? He's very likely going to take care of any competing claims. They can say Solomon was supposed to be next, but if he's dead, what are they going to do about it? So here's the plan, verse 13. "Go into King David and say to him, 'My lord the king, did you not swear to me, your servant, surely Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he will sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king?'" Now, I like this because she's not going in throwing a fit. She's just going in asking the right questions. Sometimes the right question jars us back to the right reality, right? Maybe we don't ask our kids, "Why did you do that?" Maybe the better question is, What did you think would happen? What were you trying to do? Things that jar them back to their process rather than just saying you did something bad. Help them. And David in his old age is apparently lethargic, right? He just laying around being king, which is not doing much. While you're still talking to the king, Nathan says, I will come in and add my word to what you have said. So to me, it's interesting. We don't know when David made this promise, but apparently it was known. We don't have a recorded, this was the first time he said this on this date. And the first time he said it to Bathsheba. Apparently Nathan already knew, right? So how widespread was this? But let's pause and think about David for just a moment. One of the things that he really wanted to accomplish in his life was to build a permanent temple for Yahweh. But as great a faith as he showed, he was told, you're not going to be the one. But your son will. So we're going to interject here for a moment. 2 Chronicles chapter 22. Chronicles adds some details in here that we don't get from the first king story, and so we're going to weave these two together. 2 Chronicles 22, verse 5. David said, my son Solomon is young and inexperienced, and the house to be built for the Lord should be of great magnificence and fame and splendor in the sight of all the nations. Therefore, I will make preparations for it. So, the chronicler tells us, so David made extensive preparations before his death. And you can read about that. We're not going to read all of those details. But David was making it easier for Solomon to build this temple. Verse 6, 2 Chronicles 22. Not only did he make preparations, he's preparing Solomon for the work. Then he called for his son Solomon and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord of my God, but this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name because you have shed much blood on the earth in my sight. But you will have a son who will be a man of peace and rest, and I will give him quiet during his reign. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and he will be my son, and I will be his father. Not he will be your son, David, but the Lord said, this man of peace will be my son, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom over Israel forever. In that moment, Solomon sounds more like Jesus than David. You see that parallel? It was clear to David who would be the next king. How old was Solomon? Some people suggest he might have been 15 at this time. So not a young child, but certainly not the maturity to start a grand project like this yet. But what I find instructive that I've come to appreciate, you remember Solomon had two names. The first one is Solomon. It comes from the same word as we get shalom, which means peace. So was that Solomon's first name, or did he get that name because the word that came to David was that your son will be a man of peace? The other name? Jedediah. And Jedediah means beloved of the Lord. If you're going to have some names that mean something, there are two right there. You may or may not know this, but David means beloved. And then he has a son, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. Okay? And a lot of times we go to the fact that, well, Solomon was next to king because God told David he was going to be. My question is there more to that choosing? Was Solomon chosen because of the kind of young man that he was? And who did the son of peace learn this peace? Was David, the warrior, a good teacher of that peace? Maybe. I'm not saying he couldn't have been. We can all learn and leave ways behind and teach new ways, right? Perhaps. We don't know. This is speculation on my part. Did Solomon spend a lot of time with Nathan? Because it seems to me one of the things we're already seeing with prophets, not only do they have the boldness to speak to kings the words coming from God, but they also seem to invest in the next generation. Think of Samuel building these company of prophets that he seems to be bringing up. And then by the time we get to Elijah and Elisha here in just a little bit, that seems to be a pretty common practice. So I just wonder, how much influence did Nathan have over the kind of leader, the kind of man that Solomon was becoming? But the story continues. They go in, they pull off this little scenario where she goes in and says, well, how come Adonijah's becoming king? He's had all these sacrifices. He's got Abiathar, he's got Joab. Verse 20, my Lord the king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, to learn from you who will sit on the throne of my Lord the king after him. Otherwise, as soon as my Lord the king is laid to rest with his ancestors, I and my son Solomon will be treated as criminals. That's back to 1 Kings. Now, so just as they planned, while she was speaking, Nathan arrives, and Nathan said in verse 24, have you, my lord the king, declared Adonijah shall be king after you, and that he will set on your throne? So their plan is executed. They raise the question. They don't assume to tell David. Maybe something's transpired that they don't know. Verse 27. Is this something my lord the king has done without letting his servants know who would sit on the throne of my lord the king after him? Nathan asks the appropriate question. He doesn't accuse, he doesn't rebuke, but he wants to know the answer. That's why I wonder, it adds to my wonder, is Nathan the teacher of Solomon? Because he seems to have a lot of wisdom. He knows when to push, he knows when to pull back and ask the question. To me, that's a good mark of a prophet. And of course, this is not what's intended to happen. So David starts things in motion. He calls them in. He reminds them, no, I swore to you that Solomon was going to be the next king. Notice down in verse 33, they're going to have their own coronation. Take your Lord's servants with you and have Solomon, my son, mount my own mule. I think that's probably significant. If you come riding in on the king's horse, the king's mule, we would, as good Western loving people, we would have to make it a horse, right? King could not come in on a mule. But a mule's a good, sturdy animal. And it's a king's mule. And it's not just Nathan, but it's Zadok the priest as well. And Benaniah, his bodyguard. So David's throwing all of the weight of his rule behind this, all the authority, all the royal stamp. And he also has the ability to go an extra step. Look at verse 35. Then you are to go up with him, and he is to come and sit on my throne and reign in my place. So Adonijah could claim to be king. I am king. And he's trying to get the authority to do so. But who had the authority? In this case, David. He's going to sit on my throne. I have appointed him ruler over Israel and Judah. So Adonijah appointed himself. He's forgetting that we are all subject to the true king, right? It's not what we want. I think we should be always wary of people who appoint themselves as the only one fit to rule, right? I'm the only one who can do this. You need me. I'm indispensable. It'll be terrible without me. To me, that's warning signs that they're at least neglecting to realize there is a higher power behind all of this. And so they do it. They get everybody ready. And they take Solomon to the throne. And as big a splash as Adonijah made, look what happens with Solomon. Zadok the priest, this is verse 39. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" And all the people went after him, playing pipes and rejoicing greatly, so that the ground shook with the sound. Verse 41. Adonijah and the guests who were with him heard it as if they were finishing their feast. On hearing the sound of the trumpet, Joab asked, "What's the meaning of all the noise in the city?" Even as he was speaking, Jonathan, son of Abiathar, the priest, arrived. Adonijah said, "Come in. A worthy man like you must be bringing good news." Adonijah is already acting like he's in control, right? Has no clue that he has zero control. "Not at all," Jonathan answered. "Our Lord King David has made Solomon king. The king has sent him with Zadok, Nathan, Benaniah, several other people there. He tells the story of how he's been made king. Also, verse 47, the royal officials have come to congratulate our Lord King David, saying, 'May your God make Solomon's name more famous than yours, and his throne greater than yours.'" Just think about that statement. And again, I think it gives us insight to David. If David had been full of ego and pride, would he have received that statement? or because of the work he's been doing, the preparation that he's made, a plan that's going to outlast him to build a temple to the Lord. And he's made that preparation for Solomon, and to hear those words. Clark. Right, then it could have been civil war, right? So, I don't think Nathan was the only influence on Solomon. I think very strongly as David grew, as David matured, he had some wisdom to share with his son Solomon. And not just in word, but as Clark's pointing out, in action, showing great wisdom. It wasn't about David. Right? It wasn't just him hanging on, but it was the legacy of what it meant to prepare before the Lord. And they get it, verse 49, this little coup that they had planned isn't going so well. Verse 49, at this, Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and dispersed. Yeah, they were with them as long as it's looking like, hey, that's okay. Well, let's see where this goes. But when they realized that David was acting and Solomon was king, they all go home. Like, this is over. See ya. And then Adonijah and fierce Solomon went and took hold of the horns of the altar. Then Solomon was told that, he went and he's hanging on for dear life, horns of the altar, don't kill me here. Look in verse 52. Now, put this in the context that perhaps Solomon's as young as 15, but certainly young. If he shows himself to be worthy, not a hair on his head will fall to the ground. But if evil is found in him, he will die. Now, what's brilliant about that? I mean, Solomon, as the new king, has a decision to make. How am I going to rule? And he could have stepped into a position of power and done to others what would very likely have been done to him. Right? I don't think Bathsheba's estimation that they would be killed, I think that's exactly what would happen. And by the world standards, it would have probably been okay for Solomon to do the same thing. He's just securing his kingdom. That's what you do. Clark. Yeah. Right, and so it's not Solomon's decision whether... Exactly. So let's go back to Chronicles for just a second, because it gives us an alternating view of these events. You can see there were quite a few verses there spent on this whole exchange. And maybe because it had already been written, 1 Chronicles chapter 23 tells us all of those details in this way. When David was old and full of years, he made his son Solomon king over Israel. So whatever was going on with Adonijah was really just a blip. It was just a momentary a nuisance that didn't stop the force of what was going on. Sometimes it's easy for us, speaking for myself, get frustrated with the way things are going, and it's really just something once it's passed, you're not going to even think about it again, right? It's over. It's done. But in the moment, it's so easy to get all caught up in it. Solomon didn't fall in that trap. He had bigger things to do than the little things in front of him draw him away and sidetrack him. In Chronicles, from chapter 23 through 29, we hear a story of how David, in his last days, also begins to change what the priests do, what the Levites do. Again, not just the materials for the temple, but preparing the servants of the temple to be ready. Sometimes people want to make David just a warrior, but I think there's a lot of glimpses that he had a much broader mind and thought further down the road. First Chronicles 23, verse 5. Of all my sons, and the Lord has given me many, He has chosen my son Solomon to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, Solomon, your son, is the one who will build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. We talk about, well, God chose Solomon to be the next king, but that's not David's spin on it, is it? David's spin is that Solomon was chosen to build the house of the Lord. He was going to be a man of peace. And he was going to be a son of the Most High. If all of the kings of Israel had that posture, that attitude, would the story of Israel look different? I can't at least hope that that would have caused a difference. And so it's interesting in Chronicles, much like what we were hearing in Kings, this purpose is coming through. Go all the way down to verse 10, and David says a lot of things in there that you can read. But here's what he asked the people to do. Consider now, for the Lord has chosen, and this is his charge directly to Solomon, has chosen you to build a house as the sanctuary. Be strong and do the work. So as we talk about and apply for our context, who we are today, what are we going to take away from kings and from prophets? Are we going to be like Adonijah, worried about how we're going to get power or keep power? Or are we going to be more like Solomon and figure out how to submit ourselves to God and what He has planned for us to do? It's easy for us to say, I have liberty, therefore I get to choose my way. But I think that's different for a person of faith. When we recognize that we are servants of the Most High, we say, God, what are you preparing for me to do? Right? And just like he told Solomon, be strong and do the work. I think that's important for us to remember. Clark. And the other way I would say that, is it about taking power, or is it about empowering for the work of God? I think another question this raises for us that helps me is just to ask, who do I listen to? The voices we hear matter. And we got a lot of people screaming at us with a lot of kind of different labels, some of them right, some of them wrong, some of them wolf in sheep's clothing. But voices matter. Who helps you hear the voice of God? Who helps us serve the whole, and not just to be looking out for our group and the people that are loyal to me? And just to tie back into the sermon from Sunday, I haven't forgotten it. What are my prejudices? How do I prejudge what I should have and what I should be doing and how I think about other people? Do I let my prejudging sometimes miss hearing what God is wanting? What kind of story would it have been if all the brothers said, of course, we can see the Spirit of God on Solomon, and he should be the next king? Why does an older brother who, by the world's rules, would say, no, it is mine to have, said in the Spirit of God, Solomon's the right man to do this and to lead us, because it is evident in his life? See, we're not stuck with how the story happens, how it plays out. Here's the last question I'll leave you with. How am I setting up those who come after me? How am I making it easier for them to be successful? All right, see you on Sunday. Glad you're here.